Meet the Campbells, a couple who, at first glance, seemed perfectly ordinary. However, beneath the surface of their suburban lives, something darker was brewing. What started as love and ambition would soon spiral into fraud, drugs, violence, and a suspicious amount of fake tan. By the year 2015, they weren't merely hitting the gym and changing their hair, but also reinventing themselves entirely, and as their fitness levels rose, so did their criminal empire. That is because in the years leading up to 2015, together they became the power couple behind a sprawling drug network. That was until police launched Operation Harness, where then all of a sudden everything fell apart. What followed was a collapse of truly huge proportions, including lies, betrayal, and revenge, not just from those around them, but from each other too. Because when the pressure was on, their loyalty crumbled, and that's when the underwear came off and the knives came out. So, who were the Campbells really? How did they transform from nobodies to narcotic kingpins? And how did they destroy each other on the way down? Hey there folks, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at a story that is packed with fraud, affairs, international fugitives, and cold-blooded murder. By the way, what you just saw in one of those clips was one of 5 killers who was arrested as soon as they touched down at the airport, after months of being on the run. And as for the couple at the center of all of this, well, they may be one of the most chaotic, reckless, and outright wild duos that I've ever come across. As you will soon find out, these two really did have every chance at a decent life. But do you think they took it? Well, no, of course not. Instead, they chose crime, betrayal, and ultimately, violence and murder. And so, on that note, please settle in, hit the subscribe button to be part of the Coffeehouse community, and of course, grab yourself a coffee. This is the case of Thomas Campbell. Hi there folks, and well, once again, we're in Manchester, England. Manchester is known for its grit, music, and unapologetic edge. Think of the Smiths, Oasis, Manchester United, and the Industrial Revolution all wrapped up in one city. And, well, that's basically Manchester. But beyond the bricks, smoke, and grime, it has also become a city of reinvention. One that's grown from grubby work to modern buildings, cocktail bars, and trendy warehouse flats. The city has long thrived on movement, including all things like people, ideas, money, and, as it turns out, drugs. In fact, the Greater Manchester area has struggled with some of the highest drug-related crime rates in the country. I'm talking cocaine, ketamine, cannabis, you name it basically. They all pass through the city in large quantities enough to fuel entire empires. And that's because it's a very lucrative underworld, often hidden in plain sight. Until, of course, things eventually go horribly wrong. Funny that, actually, because, as you'll see in this video, drugs really can be a problem here. And not just in the way that you'd expect. Today's story is not about your stereotypical street dealer. It's about a suburban couple with matching tracksuits, flashy holidays, and a burning desire to one-up the system and, eventually, each other. And so, on that note, it is here that we meet Thomas and Colleen Campbell. Both Thomas and Colleen grew up in the working-class suburbs of Manchester. Beginning with Colleen, she was raised by her mother nearby in the city of Clayton, unfortunately on her own. It turns out that her father walked out on them when she was only 5 years old, of course leaving a massive void in the family. As she later put it, her father went to prison and then eventually would go on to drugs, leaving her with this big drive to move on to something better. But let's just say that better would eventually mean the same thing for her. And as it turns out, Thomas, who is only a few months older than her, had several of his own demons too. Born in the year 1993, he was one of 5 children, and, as it also turns out, was known to be extremely smiley and polite at school. But despite these polite manners, he had a very mischievous side to him too. And all of this began when he was just a young teenager, when he once set fire to the Christmas tree that he had covered in hairspray. And unfortunately, things would only get worse over time too, because at the age of only 19 years old, he was caught in a violent robbery when he raided a family home with a samurai sword. Of course, he was eventually caught, charged, and then sentenced to 9 years in prison. And for most of his adult life, he was stuck behind bars while he thought about this behavior. But fate or stupidity, or maybe even a combination of the two, had other plans, and in the year 2000, 2008, after being released from prison, he and Colleen bumped into each other on a night out. Now, apparently the sparks flew instantly, but if you ask me, it was probably influenced by a whole bunch of alcohol. Anyway, from that point onwards, the two were practically inseparable, and they hooked up, and then shacked up, and then moved in together before going on to marry and have kids. Their son was born in 2010, followed by a wedding the following year in 2011, and by the year 2015, they had a daughter too. The Campbells looked like your stereotypical British family, a couple with history, love, and something solid to hold on to. Beginning with Thomas, he was cheeky, full of charm, and always grinning in photos. His father once said, "It is hard to find a picture of him where he isn't smiling." And as for Colleen, she was a fiercely loyal mum of 4. That being 2 kids with Thomas and another 2 from a previous relationship. For a while, it really did seem like they'd fallen into something comfortable and peaceful. However, not all smiles are sincere, and for Thomas and Colleen Campbell, a darker path was already forming beneath the surface, and that would soon pull both of them into a chaotic world of crime, deception, and ultimately murder. As Thomas and Colleen had settled into family life, they grew bored of the safe, secure, and slightly mundane environment that they had built. Now, for most people, that is all they could honestly ask for. But Thomas and Colleen needed more than just parenting and their average 9-to-5 jobs. They had developed a taste for the high life. And as for modesty, well, that wasn't on the menu. I guess you could see them as the Amazon Prime of crime, because they wanted everything delivered fast and with 0 effort. Soon enough, the couple were living far beyond their means. I'm talking about luxury holidays, designer clothes, and fast cars. And all of this was splashed right across their social media. There were cocktails by the pool, dolphin swims in tropical waters, and one trip to Cancun that reportedly cost them £10,000 in cash, complete with premium flights and a 5-star resort. And as it turns out, Cancun was not merely a one-off holiday either, because there were plenty of sun-soaked escapes to Sharm el-Sheikh, Gran Canaria, Bulgaria, and more. And back at home, their spending spree continued. The Campbells rolled through Clayton in matching blacked-out cars, both with them having private number plates. Thomas owned a Mercedes C63 AMG worth around £52,000. Meanwhile, Colleen owned a sleek BMW X5, which came out at £25,000. The family home had also recently undergone a £60,000 renovation, which seems to include a double-story extension, a new kitchen, and even a private bar for entertaining. Meanwhile, electric gates and a "Beware of the Dog" sign guarded the property, a statement, if there ever was one, in an otherwise modest street. And although their lifestyle seemed to be very flashy, the money behind it just simply did not seem to add up. You see, officially, Thomas hadn't actually held a real job since the year 2008. At that point, he tried to pass himself off as some sort of personal trainer, but that didn't go very well. And so, where was the money coming from? Well, it definitely wasn't from Colleen, because although she used to work as a full-time manager at Matalan, which for you Americans and Aussies out there is a British clothing and homeware store, she had actually let that job go and now was working part-time on the sly. In fact, both of them were now actually officially unemployed and even collecting benefits from the government, which barely covers the cost of living. And so, how precisely were they affording holidays, cars, home upgrades, and jewelry? Well, the truth was both simple and extremely illegal. Over the years, Thomas had quietly slipped back into the only trade that he knew well, of course that being drug dealing. And although he was caught selling marijuana in 2010, by now, he had discreetly leveled up. This time, it was all about cocaine, and as it turns out, he wasn't alone in this either, because Colleen had actually joined forces with him, and together, they would become key players in Manchester's illegal drug trade. Police would later estimate that between the years of 2009 and 2015, the couple pocketed over £100,000 in dirty cash, which ultimately is what funded their extravagant lifestyle. And apparently, in Manchester's grubby underworld, Thomas's name was reportedly climbing fast. Some people would even call him a big-time dealer, and a man who was thriving in the world of cocaine trafficking. He was was rubbing shoulders with multiple criminals, including one associate who was ultimately caught with more than £1.3 million worth of cocaine. And that is not to say that Thomas was in this by himself, because in the background, Colleen was pulling all of the strings too. Their social media profiles painted a perfect family picture. Smiling faces on speedboats, posing in nightclubs, and draped in designer brands. However, behind those photos, as we are quite aware, were many dark secrets, and it wouldn't be long before those cracks started to show. It was around this time in the year 2014 that Manchester was going through a real problem with drugs on the streets, and so it's no surprise that the police were desperately trying to fix this. And so it was around this time that they launched a little thing called Operation Harness, which was a major project initiative aiming to destroy all criminal networks across the region. Their strategy was quite simple really. All they had to do was follow the money, identify any key players in the network, and then put an end to all drugs found on the street. And as it turns out, a certain couple strongly caught their attention. And of course, I'm talking about Manchester's very own Bonnie and Clyde. Of course, that is if Bonnie had duck lips and Clyde couldn't stop posting holiday pictures. Like I said, despite their modest incomes, Thomas and Colleen were flaunting this lifestyle that quite simply didn't add up. And so, when officers noticed this, they became extremely suspicious. On March the 19th, 2015, Operation Harness was finally executed. It ended in a dramatic raid across several properties, in what officers described as a day of action. The police executed 7 warrants across Manchester, with 5 of those raids in Clayton, including Tom's and Colleen's home. And what they found was enough to get them in serious trouble. More than £60,000 worth of assets were seized. Thomas was arrested on suspicion of money laundering and conspiracy to supply drugs, while Colleen was arrested for laundering the profits of their lifestyle. In the driveway of their Clayton home, police seized 2 trophies of their success. Of course, that being their Mercedes C63 and BMW X5. For all intents and purposes, Operation Harness had well and truly done its job. The Campbell empire was now crumbling, and 4 years later, in August of 2019, their day of reckoning was finally found at Manchester Crown Court. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both admitted to concealing criminal property, which means, in short, they pleaded guilty to laundering drug money. Thomas, who was 35 years old at the time, was sentenced to 2 years in prison, while Colleen, who was also 35, received a 16-month sentence. However, it appeared that Colleen's sentence was suspended for 2 years, therefore meaning that she was unfairly spared her stint behind bars, at least for now. The glamorous yet corrupt facade that the Campbell family had built had now finally fallen apart, with their cars, their newly renovated house, and any and all cash still in reach all being confiscated. Meanwhile, national headlines ridiculed them as the benefits couple, just 2 schmucks living like royalty while they claimed welfare and raked in drug money. Throughout the following years, Colleen stood by her husband. I mean, technically, she did kind of owe it to him for taking the fall, but during this time, she would visit him in prison every single week. However, it seems like the time spent behind bars would quite literally change Thomas, and not for the better. By late 2020, he had served his time. However, even after being released from prison, tension at home still worsened, which is kind of expected between 2 criminals, I guess. But these were under new, strange circumstances. It was around this time that Thomas became paranoid and started accusing Colleen of cheating. We don't know if that's true or not, but meanwhile, Colleen claimed that he had become violent, possessive, and had even placed tracking devices on her car. But Thomas would also claim that not only was she being abusive towards him, but she was even damaging his property and leaving dozens of harassing voicemails on his phone. Apparently, her signature move was throwing her phone at his head, and she once turned up at his apartment before then spreading tuna and paint all over his living room. Quite frankly, it was chaos, and although both of them made these allegations, neither ever decided to pursue charges. But even still, the damage clearly had been done, and now their marriage was in full freefall. The final straw came in 2021 when Colleen discovered that Thomas was having an affair, and as it turns out, it wasn't just with anyone, but with her very own best friend. The betrayal cut deep, and she would later say that if this affair was with someone she didn't know, then she would maybe even be able to get over it. But with her best friend, well, that was personal. Both enraged and heartbroken, Colleen snapped. In a fit of revenge, she drove to her former friend's house, smashed the windshield of her car, and then rammed it with her own vehicle. It was an outburst that landed her straight back into court, this time for criminal damage. Oh, and by the way, it seems that Colleen was in plenty of other incidents too. For example, this surveillance footage shows Colleen and her gang mobbing someone in the streets of Manchester. They quite literally went at them with a crowbar. By the end of that year, the fairy tale between Colleen and Thomas was now over, with the two officially filing for divorce. He moved out of the Clayton home, and for a while, spent most of his time abroad, firstly in Spain and then later in Dubai. Colleen would later claim that he had apparently fled the UK because he feared that the police were closing in on him again, this time in connection with the massive EncroChat investigation, which had recently cracked open the encrypted communications of multiple drug dealers all across Europe. And whether that was true or not, Thomas did seem to be keeping one step ahead of the law. He eventually returned to Greater Manchester and then moved into his own home on Riverside, where it is noted that the house, being worth over £300,000, was sleek, modern, and in the quiet suburb of Mossley. And in a weird and unexpected turn of events, both Thomas and Colleen would eventually find some sort of peace again. Although their split had been bitter, by mid-2022, they were doing their very best to co-parent for the sake of their children. The once hostile text messages between them turned into polite exchanges, and visitation schedules were quietly agreed, while the two even appeared together at local school award ceremonies for their daughter. However, beneath that peace, Colleen was still furious. She had lost her marriage, her best friend, and the glamorous life that she had once flaunted, and in her eyes, that was all because of Tom. And as the summer of 2022 crept in, so did the first whispers of a new alliance, one that would drag both of them into a final fatal chapter. July the 2nd, 2022. It was a warm summer's evening in Manchester, and for Thomas Campbell, that night began like many others. He had returned to Colleen's home to see his children that evening, and at around 9 p.m, neighbours saw him sitting in his car with his young daughter on his lap. After kissing her goodnight, he promised that he would see her soon, and once she was safely back inside her home, he then drove off to make his way back to his own property. But sadly, Thomas had no idea that this would be the last time he would ever see his children again, because unbeknownst to him, outside of his new home in Mossley, 3 men were quietly waiting for him in the shadows. It was just before midnight that Thomas pulled into his driveway, and as he stepped out of his car and approached the front door, 3 figures then rushed towards him without warning. To his absolute surprise, one of these 3 people was a man named John Belfield, who just so happened to be the ex-boyfriend of the woman that Thomas had cheated on with Colleen. No surprise, but Thomas immediately knew that he was in trouble. A neighbor's security camera captured the men barging their way into his home. It appeared that he had fought back with everything that he had, but sadly, it was no use. Thomas was both outnumbered and overpowered, and after 2 minutes of struggling, the door then finally shut. Nobody checked on Thomas that night, and it wasn't until the next morning, on Sunday the 3rd of July, that a neighbor noticed something strange. Peering over from the street, they noticed that Thomas's front door appeared to be slightly open, and so they decided to take a closer look. And after approaching the doorway, they realized it had a large smear of blood across it, and so, no surprise, they were concerned and called the police. At around 10:30 a.m. that morning, officers arrived at the scene, and when they stepped inside, they were met with an overwhelming stench of blood. Within seconds, Thomas was found at the bottom of the stairway, where he was brutally beaten, unresponsive, and already cold. And although paramedics rushed to the scene to try and save his life, it sadly was already too late, and he was pronounced dead there and then. As is standard process, the house was then sealed off immediately for investigation. And let me tell you, when that autopsy report came back, what it concluded was absolutely horrifying. The report concluded that, over the span of approximately 2 hours, Thomas faced a level of violence that detectives would later describe as inhuman. To begin with, his ankles were bound tightly with duct tape. He was punched, kicked, and then stamped on repeatedly. Several of his ribs were shattered, and, to make it even worse, he had more than 20 stab wounds across his body. Ligature marks found around his neck also suggested that they had tried to strangle him. But perhaps the most horrifying detail of all all is that at some point during the torture, one of the attackers boiled a kettle of water and poured it all over Thomas's genitals. This was a deliberate act of cruelty that served no purpose beyond pain and humiliation. The gang dragged his broken body room by room, demanding to know where he kept his cash, jewelry, and drugs. Officers realized this was the case when they saw blood covering all of the floors, walls, and carpets, and they would later go on to describe the scene as something straight out of a horror film. The really sad thing here is that, despite the chaos, no one actually intervened. It turns out that several neighbors had heard thuds and some even heard screams. But in the quiet and unassuming street of Riverside, no one ever imagined that this was a murder unfolding right next door. By the time the attackers were done, Thomas had sadly suffered 61 separate injuries, ranging from knife wounds right the way through to blunt force trauma. Found naked, except for a pair of socks, he was bound at the feet and left bleeding and lifeless in the hallway before then being discovered several hours later. With Thomas either dead or dying, his killers then turned their attention to thievery, stuffing bin bags full of stolen goods, along with any evidence that they thought could link them back to the crime. After that, they removed the GPS tracker they had installed onto Tom's van, before then quietly fleeing the scene. The news of his murder swept quickly across Manchester, and for many in the drugs industry, it was seen as a grim wake-up call, despite it not actually being related to them. But they didn't know. For Thomas's family, the loss was absolutely shattering, and his father and brother, who were both hard men in their own right, were thoroughly broken. As for his children, who were too young to understand what was going on, they were now facing their lives without a dad. Within hours of his death, Colleen showed up at the family home, and when she saw Thomas's parents, she apparently cried like never before. Actually, his parents were stunned by how upset she was. And not only would she tell them stories about Thomas that they had quite simply never heard of before, but she would even claim that she still loved him and how she wished he would have moved back in sooner. It is said that she was really doting over Thomas here, and all of this just seemed a little over the top for her. I wonder why. Thomas's funeral took place a few weeks later. The service was both emotional and extraordinarily raw. Many remembered Thomas as a cheeky and charming man. Flawed, yes, but still loving. He was a devoted father who doted on his kids, and despite his drug background, did still actually volunteer and provide charity to his local community. It is said that 1,000 people attended his funeral, and part of the way through, they all stopped to drink a shot of Jägermeister, which they now call Jaeger Tom. Apparently, it was his favorite drink. For the Campbell family, this nightmare was sadly only the beginning. Not only did they want answers, but they wanted justice against whoever murdered their son. And lucky for them, the truth was just about to start unraveling. After his body was discovered in such a horrific state, Greater Manchester Police immediately launched a full-scale murder investigation. It was Detective Inspector Mark Davis and his major incident team that would take the lead, codenaming this case Operation Ravensburg. And from the moment that they stepped inside of Thomas's home, they knew this wasn't your average homicide. I have to say, by the way, how cool is it to give every investigation a codename? Investigators got to work straight away. And in the end, nearly 3,000 pieces of evidence were collected, including hundreds of hours of surveillance footage and dozens of statements from neighbors. One of the first major breakthroughs came from a nearby doorbell camera, and not only did it capture the haunting sounds of Thomas's screams throughout the night, but also the shadowy figures that descended on him the moment he got home. This was their first clue, and from there, the case slowly began to take shape. Officers also noticed surveillance footage captured from a Chadderton pub, which was taken only days before his murder, showed John Belfield meeting with Bruce Stephen and Stephen Clearworth. Both of them have previous criminal records, and it was assumed that at least one of them was seen with John through the doorbell camera. In this footage, they appeared to be examining something in secret, and investigators would later confirm that it was the same GPS tracker which they had found to be installed on Tom's van. Further surveillance footage would also place all three men near Thomas's daughter's school, which was also on the same day that the tracker was activated. And as detectives cross-checked phone records, another name slowly came into focus, And would you believe, it was Colleen Campbell. And all of a sudden, things were no longer looking merely sinister in this murder, they were now looking personal. It turns out that despite having no prior connection to each other, both John and Colleen were sharing dozens of calls and text messages to each other in the days leading up to Thomas's murder. And of course, that now begged the question, why? Well, you may have clocked me mentioning it earlier, but it turns out that John was actually the ex-partner of the woman that Thomas was having an affair with, meaning she too was having an affair. So, it's safe to say that both John and Colleen had common ground, and they were both deeply resentful towards Thomas. Digging deeper, detectives found angry messages sent from John to Thomas's phone in the week before his murder. The two men had never spoken before, yet here was John trying to provoke a reaction. It is worth mentioning that he never received one, and Thomas never replied. In fact, all it did was confirm what detectives were already beginning to suspect. That this was in fact a revenge killing fueled by both jealousy and anger. However, the most bizarre moment to this entire story would actually come 4 days after the murder. In the middle of apparent grief, Colleen would tell Thomas's mother that apparently she had actually heard from Thomas beyond the grave. She claimed that Thomas's ghost had told her that he had been hurt on his face by 2 attackers and not 3, and that apparently the entire thing was over a girl. Not only that, but as she described the injuries, she gestured across her cheek like this, which mimicked the exact location that only the police and his killers would know about. Throughout this hour-long discussion, all of these details that she was giving Thomas's mother were very specific. Not only that, but they were unreleased to the public. And so the only way that Colleen could have known about this is if she was somehow on the inside. And I'm talking about an actual human here and not a spirit. Now, Thomas's mother was thoroughly stunned by this, and she didn't believe Colleen one bit, but she would pretend to go along with it so she could get more information out of her. I mean, talk about main character syndrome much. We quite literally have a psycho turned psychic in the making. No surprise, but Lynn immediately went to the police after this, and just like that, Colleen's story slowly began to unravel. And when officers decided to look at her phone records, well, they realized that she'd been in contact with John shortly after the murder, but also before it had even been reported in the news. And so, only 8 days after Thomas's death, and on July the 10th of 2022, Colleen Campbell was officially arrested for conspiracy to murder. Shortly after, police then arrested Reese Stephen, who was believed to be one of the attackers seen in the video footage, and a second man named Stephen Clearworth, who helped orchestrate the plot but was not physically there on the night that Thomas was murdered. Again, it is worth highlighting that he is not the third person seen in this doorbell footage. And as for John, well, it turns out that actually he was already gone. That's because within 48 hours of the murder, he had already fled Manchester with a fake passport in hand. From there, he disappeared through Wales, and then Ireland, and then mainland Europe. In fact, he did such a good job at fleeing that eventually he would resurface in Suriname. Now, personally, I actually had no idea that Suriname was even a country up until this video. With more than 90% of the country covered in dense rainforests, it is quite understandably known as the heart of endless forests, and as you can see here, it really is quite spectacular. And not only is it a beautiful country to flee to, but also it holds no extradition treaties with the UK. Not that they even knew where he was to begin with. With John now officially off-grid, an international alert was issued, with his name being added to the UK's most wanted list, and an Interpol red notice following shortly after. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, people were still trying to wrap their heads around the story which had unfolded between Colleen and Thomas. Investigators described Colleen's role as pivotal in Tom's murder, as she was described as the architect of his death after feeding John the exact information he needed to carry out the attack. And although she later claimed that apparently she thought Thomas was only going to be robbed and not killed, it does seem that her actions would tell a completely different story. Between the psychic stunt, the phone records, and her willingness to share every detail of his routine, it was hard to believe believe that she didn't quite know what precisely was coming. Anyway, by late 2022, 3 of Thomas's 5 suspects were now officially behind bars. And as Colleen, Reese, and Stephen all awaited their trials, John remained thousands of miles away, watching it all unfold from the rainforest. While Colleen and co awaited their trials, John was living on borrowed time thousands of miles away deep in Suriname. I mean, to John, this was actually the perfect hiding spot because apart from a cousin who was also on the run, he had no connections here. And so together, they laid low in the rainforests while the world around them were completely unaware. Meanwhile, the police resumed their hunt in Manchester despite having no idea where John was. In fact, some people believed he was in Spain, others in Holland, and others in Africa. But the truth is, they were all wrong. And it likely would have remained this way too if it wasn't for John's own stupid decisions. Because despite actually finding the perfect hiding spot, he just simply couldn't help himself with ties back in the UK. Through encrypted messages, he kept in contact with his thugs back in Manchester, both offering legal advice and telling them to keep their story straight. And these messages would not only prove to be extraordinarily damning and reveal how involved he was in Thomas's death, but they would also show how little remorse he had too, because he would always be joking about Thomas. But thankfully, John's arrogance would eventually be his undoing, and in early 2023, while still trying to lie low in Suriname, he once again fell into drug trafficking in the local area. And when the local authorities arrested him on these lesser charges, it was only then that they realized that they had actually caught a British fugitive. So, John was first convicted on the drug charges and served a short sentence behind bars in Suriname. Conveniently, it brought the UK authorities time to arrange his extradition, which it turns out, despite having no treaty with the country, which Suriname officials gladly helped orchestrate. And on March the 9th of 2024, and after several months of diplomatic discussions, John Belfield was forced to board a plane back to Manchester in handcuffs, where he was then officially arrested when back on tarmac.
Marguerite, give me a search.
I need you to listen to me, alright? You're under arrest for the following offences. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder, conspiracy to murder, manslaughter, conspiracy to rob, and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later align in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. The reason for the arrest is for the prompt and effective investigation of this offence. Okay? Right, we're going to take you through, have a seat, we're going to take you through to custody.
With John on holiday for a while, time seemed to have flown by for him. By now, the first trials for a few of his friends had already concluded. So, let's switch gears to Colleen for a moment here. Colleen's trial began in January of 2023. No surprise, but a defense team argued that she had no knowledge of the brutal plan to torture or kill her husband. They also claimed that apparently she was manipulated and used by others, particularly by John Belfield, and that furthermore, she played no active role in the actual attack itself. Now, Colleen would actually admit to sharing information about Thomas's movement, but also insisted that she thought it was only to help John steal money or drugs and not to cause him harm. But the prosecution painted a very different picture here. They alleged that Colleen was a willing participant who helped orchestrate the ambush, and that furthermore, she was clearly motivated by revenge, jealousy, and greed. The trial lasted for 5 long weeks, but eventually the jury would officially hand down their verdicts. That is when Colleen was found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. As a result, she was handed only 13 years behind bars. which, if you ask me, is a total slap in the face. It was noted during the trials that, after murdering Thomas, Colleen's 3 henchmen all then fled in a white Vauxhall combo van, which was used as a getaway vehicle that they had prepared several days earlier. The 3 men then drove to a secluded Canal and Hyde, where they dumped several bin bags full of items taken from Thomas's home and torched anything and everything that could possibly incriminate them. This included them burning clothes, bloody evidence, and all the weapons that they had used. There were plenty of signs that the entire plot was premeditated. For example, to avoid detection, they even swapped the van's license plates and removed a distinctive roof vent. As a result, the vehicle was never actually found again, and it's likely that it was dismantled, buried, or even sunk in the ocean. When it came to the other trials, Rhys Stephen, who was one of the attackers, was convicted of murder, and as a result received a life sentence with a minimum term of 37 years behind bars. And Stephen Clearworth, who, by the way, was not present during the killing, just like Colleen, was also found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy. The thing that really gets me here is that, despite these being the exact same charges as Colleen, he would receive a life sentence with a minimum of 12 years behind bars, where Colleen herself received, well, basically a maximum of 13. Well, I guess this was the story that made me realize that duck-lip privilege was a thing. With John finally back in the country, his trial began in June of 2025, and although John would admit to planning the robbery, he denied any intention to kill. He would even claim that apparently Colleen had told him where Thomas might be hiding drugs or cash, and according to him, things had simply gone too far. However, the jury did not buy his story. The evidence available showed careful planning, targeted surveillance, and a savage 2-hour attack. This wasn't simply a robbery that had gone wrong, it was an execution, and on July the 3rd of 2025, John Belfield was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to rob. The next day, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 37 years. In the public gallery, Thomas's family watched on as they cried, and as John was led away, someone in the courtroom shouted, "Rotten hell." But for a man so remorseless, it is no surprise that John didn't flinch. And so, with Colleen, Rhys, Stephen and John all now behind bars, most of the masterminds behind Thomas's murder had finally been brought to justice. However, one mystery still remained. And of course, I'm talking about the identity of the third person seen in that surveillance footage, because despite there quite clearly being 3 people on Thomas's driveway, the identity of that third person has never been revealed. In fact, he is actually still out there right now, and Manchester police are still looking for him. The murder of Thomas Campbell is a stark reminder of how love can quickly turn into hate, and how in the end, nobody walks away happy. I mean, just look at this situation for example. Thomas is dead, Colleen is behind bars for a very long period of time, all of their children now grow up without any parents, 2 families are left with massive holes in their hearts, and several men are now behind bars for a very long time, with another still on the run. Quite literally, nobody walks away a winner here. And all of this for what exactly anyway? Love, sex, drugs, and ego? Colleen won't see her children again until they're basically fully grown adults, and even then, she will still have to live with the consequences forever. And sorry, but what kind of sentence is 13 years? And as for John and his cronies, well, they will basically live the best parts of their lives behind bars, of course apart from that mystery man for now. Looking back at this story, it is kind of staggering how quickly things fell apart. In just a few short years, Thomas and Colleen went from a happy, high-living couple to convicted criminals and then eventually to enemies. The other thing that surprised me actually is how well both of them actually turned their lives around before 2014. You can see in some of the older pictures how much both Thomas and Colleen physically changed. They both had very successful body transformations, and if they put their minds up to the challenge, I am sure that their success stories could have definitely fueled a profitable personal training business. But back to the actual crime, if Thomas hadn't strayed, then maybe Colleen would have never turned. And if either John or Colleen had let go of their obsessions, then maybe they wouldn't have become killers. This was a perfect storm of greed, jealousy, and vengeance on multiple people's behalves. and sadly, it sealed Thomas's fate. Greater Manchester Police called the case one of their most intensive in recent years, where detectives followed leads across borders, sifted through thousands of hours of footage, and quite literally chased John across continents. And although it took them nearly 3 years, they eventually got him in the end. There is no sugarcoating Thomas in this story. I think, credit when due, we should honour our victims when we can, but this guy was clearly corrupt to begin with. As the judge said, this was an appalling cold-blooded killing, driven by jealousy, revenge, and greed. And I guess we can all agree that no amount of holiday cash or cars could ever help Colleen or Thomas run away from the phony lives they had created through drugs and addiction. And in the end, it caught up with the both of them. And with that said, I think that just about wraps up our case today, folks, but thank you so much for making it this far. But before you go, what do you think? Do you think that Colleen was actually unaware that this would turn into homicide? And what do you think about her sentence? Should it have been longer? As always, please share your thoughts in the comments section down below. And yeah, my camera just died, so here's a video of Nero instead. I'll see you next week, folks, but until then, make sure you take care, stay safe, and stay curious. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you, and goodbye.